Well, good morning and welcome to the report launch of Understanding IMEC, a pathway to connectivity and global uncertainty. I'm Landon Darrence. I'm the Vice President for Energy and Infrastructure at the Atlantic Council, two topics that we're going to see a vibrant conversation on today. I'd like to thank all of you that joined us here in person, and for those that are online watching virtually, it's wonderful to have you as well. I'd also like to thank our esteemed guests and panelists for joining us here today in person and virtually for a discussion on the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, or IMEC, hosted by the Atlantic Council's N7 initiative. As many of you know, the N7 partnership is between the Atlantic Council and the Jeffrey M. Talpins Foundation, and it seeks to promote Middle East regional integration. Few initiatives have greater potential to reinforce regional integration and unlock the economic potential of the Middle East than IMEC. With its ambitious new trade, energy, and digital corridor expectations and ambitions that were announced at the G20 Leaders Summit in 2023. It's an ambitious agenda. IMEC promises to strengthen connectivity between major markets in India, the Middle East, and Europe via a corridor that embraces open market-driven and rule-based investment. In doing so, it hopes to power alternatives to corridors that are single entity and run by governments like the Belt and Road Initiative. IMEC seeks to reinforce supply chain security at a time when heightened geopolitical instability and repeated acts by aggression by neighbors are repeatedly jeopardizing neighborhood trade corridors, namely the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And it's focused on integrating next-generation technology that can power the economy of the future, harnessing a variety of existing trends that are already forging stronger trade ties and connectivity between countries along the corridor. These trends are driven by powerful market realities. IMEC comprises nearly half of world GDP and represents a growing consumer market of almost 2.4 billion people. The U.S. government has recognized the geostrategic and economic potential of IMEC and the opportunity it creates to reassert U.S. economic leadership in the region, including via formal endorsements by both the Biden and Trump administrations, a sign of bipartisan support in a time where that isn't always the case. Earlier this year, Trump heralded IMEC as one of the greatest trade routes in all of history. This week, the N7 initiative released a comprehensive report on IMEC that highlights the economic and geopolitical potential of this corridor, while breaking down the remaining political, financial, and regulatory challenges and barriers affiliated with the program. The challenge before the IMEC signatory governments today, including the United States, India, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, France, Germany, Italy, and the European Union, is to connect the missing pieces that exist along the corridor and to work with the private sector to overcome these barriers. While the private sector and bilateral partners along the corridor have been powering forward on a variety of projects related to IMEC, over the past couple of years, we saw a lull in activity amongst IMEC governments. At the Atlantic Council, we're pleased to see now that IMEC governments are now recommitting to the corridor. The IMEC signatory governments recently initiated a Sherpa process that we hope will lead to a high-level meeting on IMEC later this year and provide a clear path forward for IMEC in 2026 and beyond. The goal of this event is to build on the findings of the new N7 initiative report and to hear from both the U.S. government and private sector about the priorities for a renewed IMEC corridor process. Where do we see opportunities emerging from IMEC, particularly in the digital and energy sectors? What steps can governments take to resolve the remaining political and financial barriers to finalizing the IMEC trade corridor? How can they work together to streamline policies and processes that maximize the efficiencies provided by IMEC corridor and unlock the potential for private investment? To do so, we brought together an esteemed panel representing countries across the corridor to address both these questions and others from our virtual participants and audience following us online. With that, it's my pleasure to turn to a friend and colleague, Allison Miner, who's the director of the N7 Research Institute, to begin the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Landon, and thank you to our panelists, both in person and virtually, and to the audience here today. We do want this to be a dialogue, so we will begin by speaking with the panelists before moving into a Q&A session for both our virtual and in-person audience. We are trying something a little bit different today and using exclusively our online system. So for both the audience members and the people joining virtually, we would ask that you submit your questions through askac.org. With that, I'd like to start by summarizing a few of the key findings of the N7 report that we're here to talk about today. The IMEC corridor is an extremely large and ambitious initiative, and so one of the goals of the report is to try to break that down and understand where specifically the opportunities and challenges of this very ambitious corridor lie. Looking specifically at the transportation corridor associated with IMEC, we've tried to understand what were the financing gaps that actually exist to complete that transportation corridor. And if you look at the components that are not already included in credible national development plans that will be completed over the next several years, we find that the financing gap is only about $5 billion. Meanwhile, the economic potential of that transportation corridor is significant. Looking only at the efficiency gains that the corridor provides, it could provide an additional $21 billion annually in additional export valuation solely for India. And this is on top of the savings that the corridor provides, and doesn't even begin to take into account the additional exports that could grow as countries start investing in both industrial growth and market expansion as a result of the corridor. Moving on to the digital and energy components of the corridor, the report finds enormous potential for both electricity grid integration and for both subsea and terrestrial cables. And these are both associated with growth in renewable energy markets and, of course, a surging digital economy and the growth of data centers along the corridor. In all of these cases, there's huge benefit to be gained from clustering these investments in transportation, energy, and digital infrastructure to maximize benefits and maximize efficiencies. Looking beyond the components that were listed in the G20 2023 statement on IMEC, the report also finds that there's potential to explore further integrating critical mineral refining and supply chains into the corridor, as well as further expansion of data centers and advanced manufacturing. We are a Washington-based organization, so I think it's important to look at the economic and strategic benefits for the United States associated with the IMEC corridor. So that's one other component of the report. And it finds significant opportunities for reasserting US economic leadership, especially in the digital and energy sectors, for expanding opportunities for US companies, and for reinforcing US political objectives in the Middle East and globally. With that brief summary, I'd like to turn to our panelists. We're joined here today by Dane Johnston. Dane is serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East at the US Department of State, and he has been intimately involved in the latest Sherpa process that Landon mentioned that is kicking off. We're also joined virtually by Marco Arcelli. He's the CEO of Aqua Power. Aqua is a leading global power and desalination company based in Saudi Arabia that is pioneering exciting new projects in green hydrogen and energy corridors that are related to IMEC. Marco also brings deep expertise on energy and infrastructure in the Middle East and Europe, as well as government relations and policy negotiations. We're also joined virtually by Rajan Luthra. Rajan is the head of special projects at Reliance Industries, a leading Indian conglomerate with expertise in a range of sectors related to IMEC. But Rajan is also a technologist with expertise on precisely the kind of digital platforms and technological innovation that must underpin a next-generation corridor like IMEC. We're also joined by Udi Barsala, the Chief Financial Officer at Clarity, a leading cybersecurity company focused on protecting critical infrastructure across a range of sectors, with experience partnering with global leaders like AWS and IBM. We're also joined today by Mohammed Soliman. He's a manager for the Middle East at McLarty Associates, and also the author of a forthcoming book called West Asia that lays out a strategy for the United States related to IMEC. Finally, we're joined today by the two report authors, Nick Schaefer here in person, and Afaq Hussain joining us virtually from India. So with those introductions, I want to start hearing directly from the panelists. And again, just a reminder, as we're having this dialogue, if you have questions that you want to submit through our online platform, please do so through askac.org. Dane, I'd like to turn first to you. Could you speak to why the United States sees IMEC as a priority and the plans that the administration has to seize on the benefits that IMEC can provide?
Thank you, Allison. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and the N7 group for inviting me to participate today. And then also, Allison, Nick, and your guys' team, incredible report you guys published. If folks haven't read it, I highly encourage you to do so. It's going to be a great asset as we work to shape and frame IMEC going forward. But to take on your question, I guess this is a great chance to answer one of the common things I'm asked when we're talking about IMEC. Is with the name of India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, how and why does the United States care? Like, why are we involved? Especially with this administration's American First foreign policy approach. And the answer is actually quite simple. I think we can go back to February when Prime Minister Modi visited the White House. President Trump reaffirmed America's endorsement of IMEC, and he's done so now several times. And so following the lead from the president, we've come to recognize the immense geopolitical and economic opportunities IMEC offers. I would say kind of the first way on the economic side is it's an opportunity for American companies, whether that be financing through private capital or coming in as trusted partners and vendors on the various energy, digital, and transportation projects, and really leverage the innovation our private sector boasts for the initiative. And at the same time, IMEC is a chance to help shape and frame a lot of the, with common sense regulatory customs, standards, and really break down some of what we view as unfair non-tariff trade barriers to really unleash American product into the region. So there's a lot going on with IMEC, and we're looking forward to really being engaged and working with our incredible partners. I'm glad we have some of our private sector folks from across the entire corridor joining us today, and I think that underscores the point that on the U.S. side, we truly see this as a private sector-driven initiative. We see it as a great opportunity for the private sector to get involved in a handful of profitable projects, and we look forward to seeing what's next in store. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dane. And would you be able to share with the audience what you expect the next steps for the IMEC signatory country process?
Yeah, so you guys kind of alluded to it. Earlier this month, I was in India for the first in-person meeting of all the MOU signatories, or 7 of us were there. The Saudis were unable to attend. But this was a great opportunity to kind of lay out the foundation, kind of what we see as our common vision and how we're going to move forward. And we're still working through some of the details of the governance structure and what's all that's going to look like. However, I think there's pretty common consensus that we want to have a ministerial later this year. Where that will be or when that will be is still being planned out. But there's great momentum going. I feel like for the first time since 2023, when it was signed, we're actually kind of seeing this turn from an idea to a reality.
That's great to hear. Marco, if I could turn next to you. Aqua Power recently made some exciting announcements on green hydrogen and an electricity corridor between the Arabian Gulf and Europe. Could you tell us a little bit more about those announcements and the opportunities that you see to leverage the IMEC corridor to promote energy integration across the region?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I represent Aqua Power. Maybe it's not a household name in the United States. So just to give you a brief introduction, we are a company that is 20 years old, but already has over $117 billion of investments in the energy transition. So combined cycles, gas-fired, renewables, water desalination, as you mentioned, we're the largest in the world, and green hydrogen, where we have invested together with our products. So we use a lot and we partner a lot with American companies in the region and beyond. So we have invested there more than $6 billion already to date. So we are a Saudi company, Saudi-based company, but we operate in 15 countries. And because of our success, we achieved the lowest cost of power generation in renewables, of water desalination, and arguably in green hydrogen in the world. So His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince, gave ACWA Power kindly and generously the mandate to be the private sector representative for Saudi Arabia on IMEC and for power export and green hydrogen export. And I think this builds on the fact that Saudi Arabia is endowed with great natural resources, so wind, but especially solar. We have more than 3,000 hours of equivalent hour per year of solar power, solar irradiation. So that makes our cost the cheapest in the world. To give you an idea, the lowest cost we have achieved is just around $11 per megawatt hour for solar power. So here, renewables are not built out of ideology, and the renewables can be very cheap. So the idea is basically to make Saudi Arabia a hub to supply energy to neighboring countries, but in particularly to Europe. So the event that we had back in July with all other private sector companies from mainly Europe. So we had EnBW from Germany, we had Edison from Italy, we had TotalEnergies from France, and we signed a memorandum of understandings to do a deep feasibility study by the end of the year for the power corridor linking Saudi Arabia and Europe, while we also signed a joint development agreement for another very large-scale green hydrogen project, bringing the molecules to Europe. In that instance, we also signed some agreements with key potential suppliers, including several American companies, and that I think undermines also the great potential for European and American manufacturing companies and suppliers to be a significant part of this project.
Thanks so much, Marco. And could you speak to how you see the role of IMEC governments helping facilitate the success of some of those initiatives?
You know, I always say that the biggest success that I see in our markets, where we are able to go fastest and with great results, is countries where we have a combination of three things. So a vision by leaders, strict dialogue with investors, and then quick decision making. So I see that no projects, infrastructure projects, cross-border projects, energy projects really can happen without a strong support from the political side, from local governments, because you're touching on to the production ecosystem of a country, the competitiveness of a country, the regulation of a country, and the success of a country. So unless there is a strict cooperation between IMEC and the private sector, I think that this will be something that will be dragged on for many years. But if we find the right way to have this vision, shared vision between the private and the public sector, dialogue between the private and the public sector, and then quick decisions on both sides, then I think that it can happen quick. It can happen, within the next 5 to 10 years, and it can really strengthen the relationship between the Middle East, Europe, the United States, and then on the other side to India, and really become something that will be a big legacy that we will leave behind, that will make these regions more competitive, more solid, and potentially expand also to neighboring regions here in the Middle East and in Africa, to become kind of like a beacon of stability, progress, and better living conditions for a lot of people who do not have today the same ability to progress as we enjoy in our countries.
Thanks so much, Marco. It's a very inspiring vision, and I really like your recipe for success of vision, dialogue, and speedy decision-making between the public and private sectors. That's very helpful. Rajan, I'd like to turn next to you and thinking about the digital corridor of IMEC. Can you speak to where you see the greatest opportunities in that component of the corridor, and how the private sector should be working with IMEC governments to maximize those opportunities?
Sure. Thank you, Alison. Good evening, good morning, everyone. I think the digital infrastructure part of the IMEC corridor is what I will maybe touch upon briefly. Like the energy or the transportation part, in my view, the digital infrastructure is going to be critical to connect all the countries with each other in a far more resilient manner than ever before on one side. But I think the real opportunity is also about the innovation, especially around the collaborative innovation around critical technologies as well. I think there is a whole lot of innovation and developments happening on some of the critical and emerging technologies across Europe, across the Middle East, across India as a hub as well. I think it really is up to each of the countries and I think the private and the government stakeholders to streamline and drive far deeper collaboration in bringing some of the cutting edge research on these technologies to the market and to really enable it for a far wider growth of the market segments themselves. India has taken the lead in many, many areas around the digital capability, both on the government side and the private side as well. On the government side, we have scaled up multiple large programs that are well known publicly globally now. And the digital infrastructure that has been created around 4G, 5G, and now being planned for the 6G kind of capability by private sector players like Jio, I think that is also enabling a whole lot of indigenous IP being created and that being available for the global cause as well. And I think just briefly, if I may touch upon one of the potential concerns or challenges which will always remain is around the need for building resilience at the design stage itself. We have high capacity subsea fiber optic cables, which are becoming more and more prone to all kind of threats from espionage, from tampering, or even from sabotage. And I think those concerns need to be addressed both on the maritime side as well as over the surface. And that resilience is one of the areas where, again, the governments and the private sector will need to collaborate and plan together. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rajan. I think the point on resilience is a very salient one, and one where, as IMEC thinks about being a corridor of the future, that it really has a lot of value to add to build on the existing infrastructure that can be a bit more bottlenecked. And it's a great point and thought for governments on the need for that collaboration and research and development on critical and emerging technologies. Udi, turning to you and maybe pulling on this piece of resilience, IMEC is emerging in an environment of growing cybersecurity threats. What steps should governments and the private sector be taking now to ensure that the infrastructure associated with the IMEC corridor is secure for an economy of the future?
Okay. First of all, thanks, Alison and the N7 group for having me. A little bit more color about Clarity. Clarity is a global cybersecurity company, and we focus on protecting cyber physical systems, including the OT, the operational technology, the IoT, and the industrial IoT. Our mission is basically to secure the infrastructure, industrial network, healthcare, against any cyber threats and basically minimize any downtime and risk. We've been around for 10 years. We operate in a global adoption in 50 different countries around the globe. We serve today over 1,300 enterprises across different industries, such as manufacturing, energy utilities, power and water, oil and gas, transportation, things like this project is about airline, airports, ports, rail and maritime, data centers, and healthcare. Basically, our technology provides a platform that delivers visibility and risk vulnerability management, network protection, threat detection, and secure access. If we think about this corridor actually includes all of these elements that I talked about, those critical infrastructure that we protect. If we think about it in today's world, about 70% of the organization in critical infrastructure were hit by ransomware over the past 4 years. This is a huge number. And in order to make sure that this project is successful, basically there should be an assessment in terms of what are the risks from a cybersecurity perspective that are there, and basically put the necessary cybersecurity infrastructure basically across the entire corridor, right? If you think about it, basically from maritime through the pipes, data center, solar energy, any type of renewable energy, and that's basically across the board. So this is a massive project that introduces a significant threat surface for hackers from different places. And you can see all the benefits of having that corridor for the world, but there will be others that would want to prevent this from happening. And that's why making sure that there is security in place as the project is planned is super critical for the success of this project. I would treat it as an insurance to make sure that this project can run smoothly.
Thanks so much, Rudy. I think that's a very good reminder as we're seeing the momentum with the corridor really taking off in recent months, and a good reminder on the scope of the threat that countries are facing as well. Mohammed, if I could turn to you, again, sitting here in Washington, D.C., can you speak to where you see the greatest opportunities for U.S. businesses along the corridor, and what are some of the opportunities and challenges to seizing those opportunities?
I mean, Alison, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you, Nick. Thank you for the Atlantic Council for putting this together, and the report is a fantastic piece of work, so I really thank you for all of this. Let me step back and give you my overview of why this is extremely important from a financial and geopolitical standpoint, and then I will tell you more about the business opportunities. The essence of IMEC is how can we do more with less in the Middle East? And this means we are pivoting from nation building to order building. So our major interest here is how can we link all these sub-regions together? And those sub-regions are extremely important because this is where growth is taking place. When you're looking to the chart post-COVID and you see where are the business opportunities and growth, it's India, which remains the fastest G20 economy. It's the Gulf states. When you talk to the business community here in Washington, in SF, in New York, where are you going to take your company global? They will say, well, take us to Abu Dhabi, Riyadh, Doha. This is where the growth is. So from a financial standpoint, from a capitalist standpoint, this is where the growth is. And of course, Europe, they're not really a passive player here. They have been looking for a geo-economic reorientation, especially following the Ukraine war. And what else that's more important for Europe than pivoting to the east, pivoting to Asia, through a corridor that links the Mediterranean to the Gulf to India. So directly to your question, so what are we talking about here if you are a business in the United States? I would say you have 3-4 elements that are extremely important. One, I would say the AI infrastructure are the biggest growth opportunity, and this is not really hyperbolic. There's a reason why President Trump was in his first major trip was to the region, and all these tech CEOs were in Riyadh, because the major data center buildup that's taking place in the Gulf is, I think, beyond people's imagination understanding of the question of a scale. And this sort of capacity will be servicing this arc from the Indian subcontinent to the Mediterranean. And you will see G42 and Emirati AI champion working with the French, the Italians, the Greeks. They're doing Hindi LLM out of Abu Dhabi. So this corridor is already taking place in the AI infrastructure. So this is where growth is. Data center buildup, ships, sovereign solutions to those countries. The second thing is the question of energy. And here energy is not really defined in a very minor way as crude. I would say electricity and grid integration is a really major part of it. You can really talk about AI integration without really talking about electricity integration. So this is a major part. Next generation energy, and I would say this is where nuclear is extremely important. Next generation nuclear reactors, SMRs, are making headwinds here, and we have seen this with the US, Bahrain, MAUs, I think a month ago, correct me if I'm wrong. And the third thing I would say, logistics. This whole thing that we're talking about is not just a railway, one mode of transportation. It's beyond that. It's basically how you're going to service this massive geography and servicing all these goods and services that are going through the Arabian Desert. This is a major part. So infrastructure is going to be part of it. So if you're Bechtel or Adani, this is a way of growth. And finally here, I would say people-to-people ties within the corridor are extremely important. I know this is not really being mentioned a lot, but how can you also build a framework where all these peoples are in a much more resilient cultural way? So tourism will be part of that. This is also another way of growth.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. And do you think, looking at those opportunities in things like AI and nuclear, are U.S. companies already well poised to seize on those opportunities? Or as we're thinking through the role of the U.S. government, the role of other governments, are there steps that need to be taken to better position those companies?
Excellent question, but I would say American companies are really taking the lead on this. You will see this with Stargate UE, this is so OpenAI, it's Cisco, Oracle, SoftBank, of course endorsed by the US government, working with the Emiratis, and they're trying to literally saying we're going to be servicing emerging markets through this hub in the UAE, so India to the Mediterranean. You also see this with American construction companies. I always come to my mind, Bechtel, the same thing when it comes to the aviation. You will see Boeing front and center, the biggest sales coming to Boeing coming from the region. When it comes to ships, you will see NVIDIA and Google, the biggest cloud buildup is there. So I would say American companies are really taking the lead on that. And also I would say they're pushing policy and policymakers for the ride. I would say they see this as a growth opportunity for the companies, and therefore the U.S. government is seeing that this is not just a bunch of thought leaders getting together, signing MOU. There is actually something there that we need to build on.
That's great. I'd like to turn next to Afaq. We haven't spoken too much about the transportation component of the corridor, and I'd like to hear what you see as the really priority next steps, especially as these governments are convening to finish off some of those critical missing links in the transportation corridor.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Thank you, everyone. I think transportation corridor is going to be one of the critical elements of the whole corridor. And so we need to first look at the missing link, and we all know that's primarily in the Middle East, which is the railway missing link. And most of those, which is around 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers, and most of that falls part of some national government plan or other. But there are around 600 kilometers primarily in Jordan and some part of UAE, but mostly in Jordan, because Jordan doesn't have a national railway as of now. So that is going to be the critical element to get at least the corridor ready. So you need to have that corridor in place, the missing links connected, and then would come the connecting those missing links with each other, because there is going to be difference in railway gauges, difference in certain technicalities. So that needs to be connected, linked together, and then comes the upgradation of existing infrastructure, whether it is the seaports, or it is the existing railway links, like Etihad Rail is building a huge network right now in the whole GCC. So all that needs to be built, keeping in mind the IMEC connectivity across the countries. I think that's one critical element, the physical connectivity, which needs to be completed. Next comes the digital connectivity. The digital connectivity is, again, a very, very important thing in this, because when we are moving cargo from one part of the world to another part of the world, and it is crossing different countries, I think that seamless movement of documents, seamless movement of trade information, the cargo information has to move from each of these countries. We have very recently seen that example coming out between India and UAE. India and UAE started a virtual trade corridor based on a technology platform called MyThree, which is a technical platform. And through that, the exchange of information, exchange of document happens between India and UAE. So it's a virtual trade corridor. Goods are moving physically through physical corridor, and then documents are being exchanged in a virtual trade corridor. That is what we need to expand to beyond UAE. But having said that, that will be a challenge, a task to be done, because India UAE is easy to be undertaken because of the free trade agreement that India and UAE has. And with the help of free trade agreement, you have those duty components which are not there. So the regulations will be far less than in a normal trade because of the free trade agreement. Then you have harmonized each other's certifications. That also makes it easier. So to get that kind of a framework into the participant countries in the whole corridor, it will need some this group coming together, the technical group coming together, talking to each other, discussing various technicalities, the trade technicalities, harmonizing those standards. That's going to be important. Harmonizing even the way data is being recorded by different countries, as simple as that. How each country records data, how the customs of each country records the data. Even that needs to be harmonized for this platform to be working across the corridor. So these are the two critical elements in terms of the transportation corridor that one needs to look at: completion of the physical corridor, as well as this digital corridor that needs to be put in place. And we are recommending a sort of a working group on the digital integration as well, which could be driven by the ministries of information technology, maybe in India, UAE, and other countries, to come together and develop that. And customs obviously has to be part of that. So I think that's the kind of brainstorming, that's the kind of discussion that countries need to have together to actually make this feasible. We have to keep in mind efficiency is going to drive this corridor. If you are not able to make these technical and mechanical efficient systems in place in terms of mechanization, in terms of technology innovation, then we may lose out on efficiency, which eventually may not give us the envisaged benefits that this corridor is going to offer in terms of reduced time and cost efficiencies. So these two are going to be really critical for this corridor.
Thanks so much, Afak. And I think it's very important to remember that even for the transportation corridor, it's not just about the hard infrastructure, that this integration really matters and is a huge task, frankly, for governments, given just how large the corridor is. Nick, if I could turn to you, again, thinking about the objective of this panel, which is to think through priorities for the IMEC governments as they're launching this new coordination process. Could you summarize some of the key recommendations from the latest report about what you think the priorities need to be for those governments?
Yeah, I think, well, first off, I think that having such an esteemed panel here with such diverse perspectives, I hope it also gives a sense to everybody watching today of how incredibly all-encompassing IMEC is. Since IMEC launched in 2023, it's really been a wishing well, where so many people have been throwing different I want this, and kind of making a piecemeal initiative, where a lot of people have been working on things bilaterally, calling it IMEC, and then also trying to make the sum bigger than the whole bigger than the sum of the parts. And we're now at a point, it's great to see, one of the key recommendations that we had in the report was for a ministerial process, was to start moving towards a coordinating body, perhaps a secretariat. And I think that that's really, as we were going through the research that went into this report, Afak and I, and engaging with many people here in the room and also with us virtually, is really that we need a coordinating body. We need to have a forum, a place that we can go and engage, that everybody knows who the right points of contact are across the governments. I mean, one of the challenges is what we just touched on, 3 primary areas: trade and logistics, energy, digital, plus the political layer and geopolitics of it. And so that's a lot of stakeholders that you have to coordinate to be able to actually make technical and tangible progress. And so that push for coordinating body, that push for ministerial, that push for clear appointees, both in the US government, but then also in partner governments, and knowing who the interlocutors are, is really critical to move forward. One of the things that we heard often when we were engaging on IMEC in the last year is that a lot of the landscape is changed. This initiative was launched in September of 2023. Events of whether it's the changes in the US-India relationship, whether it's the new geopolitics of the region, post-October 7th landscape, there's very real challenges that an initiative like IMEC has to overcome, address, and proactively to incorporate into the way that the initiative is approached now in 2025. And when you look at a map of the Middle East, I mean, in our executive summary that we've printed in front of us today is on the website, you see a map with the primary corridor, the main backbone, which comes from the GCC, links from Mumbai and Maharashtra, all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean via Haifa port. IMEC is also a web of routes. It's also looking at how is it incrementally, and on our page, and I think it's like on page 30, 40, Afak, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's page 30 or 40 of our report. We have another map showing the future potential integrations. The optimism that's surrounding Syria, thinking about a coordinated approach to understanding how IMEC can fit into Syria and thinking through proactive ways in the north. Looking at Egypt, the rapidly deepening Saudi-Egyptian relationship. There's so many interesting parts of IMEC that there is value on the table for companies, for governments, and it's a matter, and the key recommendation of our report is building that coordinating body, building that forum, so that everybody knows where to go and where to align to make sure that we can realize that potential.
That's great, thank you. And I do want to just go back on some of your points to something that you said, Dane, about the role of coordinating with the private sector and the importance of this being a private sector-led initiative. And we've heard a lot about the private sector companies who are taking charge in that today. As the Sherpa process is kicking off, what kind of structure do you envision for coordinating with the private sector to make sure that there is that seamless coordination? And to go back to some of Marco's points, the vision, the dialogue, the speedy decision-making between the public and private sectors?
Yeah, no, I think all of that is very, very important. But before I want to hit on that, this kind of goes back to something that Afaq was saying, is he gave all these examples of what the private sector is already doing. And you can make the argument, IMEC is already happening. You know, there's already trucks going from UAE out to Israel and to Europe. And so when we talk about the government's role, I think it's truly coming in and making the harmonization of that. How do we make it more efficient? How do we make it easier, make it cheaper? And I think that's one of the great opportunity IMEC possesses. And also to kind of answer your question, one of the things that we're kind of working on and discussing are simple steps like coming up with pilot projects. Seeing all right, before we make this big massive commitment, let's see on the ground, okay, how does this work? What's this going to look like? But talking about the role of the coordinating body, it's a process. It's a process I've come to learn. Not being in government too long, you learn a little bit working with all the multilateral aspect of things. But I think there is kind of a shared vision for it. And I think in regards to how we engage with the private sector, this is a great example here. Think tanks like Atlantic Council and then N7 Group, when you brought together all of these private sector and government folk, where we can kind of have these dialogues and have these conversations. I think that also looks like, kind of putting together more informal gatherings. I was just in Abu Dhabi and Dubai earlier this month. And coming from the US and then going there, seeing the enthusiasm for IMEC, seeing that all these business executives, they all knew what IMEC was. They all want to know how to get engaged. So I think there definitely is that private sector interest. It just takes the governments either in a coordinated effort or kind of, on the bilateral, smaller scale to really go out, have those dialogues, and really learn from the private sector what is feasible, what's going to work. So I think that's kind of where we're looking at from the government perspective and the coordinating body.
That's great. And I certainly hope that the N7 initiative can continue to help bridge some of that dialogue between the public and private sector and think through some of these very specific priorities on the policy and regulatory environment across all of the sectors. If I can go back to you, Rajan, the digital component of the corridor is one of the most complex, especially because it is such a changing industry. Thinking again about that policy and regulatory environment that governments need to facilitate, are there specific things that government should be doing to promote digital infrastructure to address complicated issues like cross-border data management? Can you think through specific priorities in the digital component of the corridor for governments?
Yeah, I think firstly, as Fak already mentioned, I think there is a lot of uniformity and harmonization that needs to be brought to the table. And more so in the digital space as well, because I think even about the regulations, if we were to talk about briefly, I think each of the sovereign governments will have their own priorities, will have their own push and pulls internally. But I think for the real, let's say, digital trade or digital services to be happening in a real-time world, there is a lot of harmonization of policies and regulations that will need to happen in the next, in a very short time frame, I would say. that will become the backbone of a lot of other, let's say, enablements that will happen for the rest of the infrastructure to be built around as well. I think in addition to that, there is also something which we have not touched upon so far collectively, is that given the geopolitical dynamics and also the legacy of the past, ultimately we will also have to have a very deep level of trust between all the stakeholders, both private and public, among all the countries as well. And I think that will only happen when there are more integrated people-to-people ties as well. Bilaterally, there is a lot of good work that is happening between India and rest of the entities in the IMEC corridor. But I think that needs to be further strengthened through a much bigger effort by the governments themselves, including maybe enabling more frequent flights, including maybe enabling better connectivity or movement of people being better enabled at an overall level. Those are some of the softer matters, but I think in the long run they will have a bigger impact as well. And I think then obviously there are going to be challenges around the financial aspects as well. And I think those are maybe 2 or 3 points that I would recommend the governments to be supporting some of the private initiatives. I think a little more clarity on how this is progressing, on how the timelines are going to evolve. I think that kind of awareness in the private sector also is very important. As the report mentions, what I have heard so far is the setting up of a coordination body is going to be very important, so that if anybody has any queries on the topic, there is at least some nodal entity that provides all the required information or can at least collate all the questions and queries that the private sector entities would have. I think those are some of the initial thoughts from my side.
Thanks, Rajan. I think that's a really important point about providing the clarity for the private sector, who is making not insignificant investments in this infrastructure, thinking 5, 10, 20, 50 years ahead of time. If they don't have that clarity in the political environment and the commitment of these countries, it's going to be very hard to make those investments. And a huge advantage of a potential high-level meeting later this year or in the coming months. And I think your point about the people-to-people point, one that Mohammed made as well, I fear, Dane, we're just making that coordinating structure even more complex across the sectors and the countries and the technical areas. But I think it's a really good point about building that trust between the people and then the ties that will facilitate both the political and the private sector cooperation across such a large area. With that, I see that we have questions piling up from the audience. Again, just a reminder for folks online and here with us today, if you could submit your questions to askac.org. And I'd love to start turning to some of those audience questions. So,
jobs and foster economic growth in the region, especially in the Middle East and Asia. Thank you.
So just in case folks didn't hear, this is our testing out of an audio question from Alex, who asks, how will IMEC create jobs and foster economic growth in the region, especially in the Middle East and Asia? Mohammed or Nick, is that a question you feel like you could answer?
So I think that what you're seeing, we used the word clustering earlier today, and clustering investments. I think when you're looking at the GCC and the Levant, there's different impacts of IMEC and investments related to these sectors that will boost different parts of the economy. So our report actually looks at, on the GCC side, where there's a lot of strategic investments in the clustering of renewable energy, desalinization, data centers. That's part of the current tech and data-driven boom in the GCC. For Jordan specifically, our report actually looks at ways that Jordanian exports can increase their competitiveness through IMEC efficiencies. I mean, Jordan only has one port, Aqaba port, and so if there's effective development of special economic zones and SEZs that could be created either for tariff-free export or for deals for export either to the US market or other adjacent markets, there's ways that we could look at SEZs that could help stimulate domestic manufacturing in Jordan, which could also help address other issues like Jordanian unemployment that could help support local livelihoods. So I think there's lots of creative ways that manufacturing, specifically special economic zones, as well as thinking through trade, regional trade deals and how IMEC countries might be able to fit into that in the future administration strategy in the US. There's definitely ways that I think that you could see direct economic growth, both in export-driven markets like Jordan, as well as in more capital-driven markets like the GCC.
Great.
I would add one thing. Don't think about the Gulf states as only a source of capital, because this is not where they are, and this is where they are heading. You'll see a lot of automation, a lot of industrialization that's taking place in UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain. I would even argue Oman is also going through a phase of transformation. So don't think about them as just a transit between India to Europe. I would argue right now they are in a much more advanced position than the Europeans on some of those services and digital goods.
Great point. And I don't know, Marco, you're sitting in Saudi Arabia. Any additions you want to add about how we think about the Gulf states and their role in this corridor? I think your audio is off, Marco.
Sorry about that.
No worries.
I was saying that besides the wealth of natural resources that can be made available to neighboring countries and then onward to Europe, I think that there's excellent expertise that we have here. I always joke that ACWA Power is turning Saudi Arabia from the largest exporter of oil to the largest exporter of desalination and low carbon technologies around the world. We have great research center and institutional centers. So this is all something where there is a wealth of knowledge that can be explored and expanded across the corridor. And regarding also, the jobs that the job creation that you were discussing, I think simply ACWA Power today employs more than 4,000 people, just direct employment, but more than 60,000 people in our sites, basically construction sites. And these will be along basically the corridor. So that is when I said that I think that this is a wealth that will spill over across the just pure countries of the corridor, but even in neighboring countries, and the opportunity is phenomenal.
Very exciting. Our next question is from Hani, and Hani asks, what sort of overlap do you see between initiatives involving the US, such as I2U2 and IMEC? Dana's our US representative. Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. I mean, there's clear overlap. I mean, you have, well, I guess 3 of the I2U2 countries are also MOU signatories for IMEC. And they both are promoting some form of the regional integration. And I think that is a very key piece of the vision of IMEC is, the President Trump has a very big vision of peace. Something we always like to say and quote him from his trip to the Gulf is, we want commerce, not chaos. And I think that IMEC and I2U2, in a sense, are both fruitions of that vision of regional integration and peace. There's as of now, those 2 are separate still. I'm not going to allude to what's going to happen in the future, but as of now, they're still separate, and this is something we're working through and thinking through. So that's about that at this time.
Thanks so much, Dane. I know it's a lot to tackle, and we have other questions here about the geopolitical environment and some of the geopolitical risks to IMEC implementation, and that includes the tensions that we're seeing across the Middle East and specifically in the Red Sea. Can you maybe build on that to see how you see IMEC addressing that?
No, I appreciate Cindy's question. With that, I mean, I think one of the key ways to look at things is economic security is national security. And with IMEC is an alternative to the Suez. It's not replacing, it's an alternative. It's building that trade resiliency. I think that's a key part. We've seen plenty of examples over recent years of when trade disrupts, the negative impact that has on America and then also the world. So having IMEC as an alternative, which is, there's, as your report wonderfully lays out, there's a lot of potential for it to be even faster than some of the overseas transit. And I think also there's an argument to be made that, some of the conflict in the region further suggests the need for an IMEC, suggests the need for an economic integration plan that can bring together countries that may have historically in the past had their differences. But I think everybody can agree that everybody likes boosting up their economies. And so I think using that as a tool to promote and address these geopolitical risks is going to be very, very important going forward.
Yeah, and you spoke, Nick, about the importance of a multiplicity of routes, even embedded within IMEC to provide that resilience.
Yeah, and I'd invite Mohammed also to talk in and maybe talk about his books funding too, because I think you have been doing a lot of work in this space for a while. But it's true, it's like when you look at the region, geography doesn't end at a border. Eurasia doesn't end at a border. Connectivity is going to happen regardless. Part of what you see that drove I2U2 in LEAD of 2022, as well as IMEC in 2023, and the continuing momentum in some of the bright spots. The Gulf and India have a rapidly deepening relationship across strategic elements, economic growth, and so these neighbors are going to grow and integrate, and that the role of these initiatives is to facilitate that growth, align it so it can reach a larger sum, and go beyond the borders of what's immediately around them. And so I think that when you're looking at these web of routes, you're seeing movement. You're seeing in June or May, Saudi Arabia and Egypt signed an MOU about developing rail in Straits of Tiran. Obviously Syria, there's tons of companies that are looking at Syria and rapidly investing in Syria to give the new environment there. And so when we're thinking about IMEC, it's really about a phased implementation of a vision of integration, a web of routes, which connects the region and can link East and West in new and dynamic ways that untaps way more latent economic potential and geopolitical dividends that comes from that.
Mohammed, anything you want to add there?
I want to build on what Dane and Nick have said. This is not really a competition between which route, which railway, which port. I think this is more of adding a framework on an existing commercial relationship that exists. To just give you numbers, India and Europe trade is about $115 billion. The trade between India, UAE, and Saudi Arabia collectively is about $150 billion. And this could be up to $200 billion within 2 to 3 years. So this is really a really increasing volume of trade, and just between three countries. And why I'm saying that? For a few reasons. One, all these countries are going to be rethinking always constantly about different ways of doing trade, right? IMEC made sense in 2022, 2023. Maybe we need to think about a different sort of doing trade. It doesn't mean undermining IMEC, but it means that we have to think, like Nick said, about geography in a much more innovative way. And one of the things that makes IMEC and I2U2 important, this is something that's the theme of the book that I've been working on for the last 4 years, is it ended the separation of geographies. The idea that the Middle East is somehow separate from South Asia. Those two sub-regions were never part of the same British Empire, never had any sort of trade relationship 1,000 years ago, and now somehow we should really treat them as a part of the same space. Those are indictment that those two sub-regions are actually one region, from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And if you accept this sort of premise, it's Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, you will accept the premise that Suez Canal, the Turkey, Syria, Kuwait Road, the IMEC corridor, the I2U2 are complementary. They're not really a competition. They're basically mainly to build economic growth for all these countries and making sure that there's a cohesive framework for trade, for people, for understanding between those regions. I mean, the very idea that India and the Gulf and the Mediterranean countries were never really a part of any sort of political framework to discuss risk is already an insane idea, but this is the history and the package of the Cold War and the British Empire that we're dealing with, and we're trying to figure out what's a new way for the 21st century to do business.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a really great point, and I like that framing of breaking down the separation of geographies, and that applies even when you look internal within the Middle East and some of the divisions that have divided the region there, but then also beyond in some of these other regions. And I fear, myself being a former government person, that the private sector is a little bit faster in catching up to the need to break down those artificial divisions than governments often are. I'd like to take this next question from Izzy. But how do you see the connection between Jordan and Israel as a bridge of IMEC to the Mediterranean Sea? Nick and Afak, is that something that you can speak to based off of your research in the report?
I'm happy to, unless Afak maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's Jordan and Israel is going to be a very, very critical link here. Because as I told you earlier also, the railway doesn't exist in Jordan as of now. And with this link, if this comes up and this link comes up, it's going to be the connecting bridge. And in Israel, Israel is then the gateway port to the Mediterranean. And in Israel also we have Haifa, then we have Ashdod. And I would add another link. Ashdod and Haifa should be linked. Both the ports should be linked to enhance the capacity of overall corridor, which would, because right now we're only talking about Haifa. I think Ashdod would also be an important link to bring that together and build that link also, Haifa and Ashdod, along with this Jordan-Israel connectivity link. I think that's what will really enhance the capacity of the whole corridor. Because on the one side, we have ports of UAE like Jebel Ali, which has like 14 million containers, handling 14 million containers. So on the other end also, we need to link that, we need to pick it up. And right now, if you bring together Ashdod and Haifa, we reach around 3 million TEUs, while the plans are to enhance it to 5 million. So I think that point of Jordan-Israel connectivity, I think that's going to be a very, very critical to actually leverage the potential of the corridor.
Mm-hmm. And to add on to that point too, it's also a question of feasibility. There's only a 12-kilometer gap between the Israeli national rail system and the Jordanian border to Sheikh Hussein. And so when you're talking about proof of concept, like I mentioned or alluded earlier with Egypt and Syria and other potential routes, in our report, again, it's somewhere in the second half of the report, we have a great map where we look at kind of lay out kind of potential future railroads that is built along this feasible corridor. In terms of, from a technical perspective, leaving kind of politics and all those questions aside, from a technical perspective, the most feasible, easy route to get from GCC to Eastern Mediterranean currently is from the Israel plus Jordan to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That doesn't preclude or compete with other routes that probably should be included in the future. But that question of feasibility is really important when looking for proof of concept. Because once you get proof of concept, once goods are being transshipped, there's real life data about cost of transshipment. So you don't have to presume a lot. You can actually compare for businesses to say what's the cost competitiveness for certain types of goods. Then that can grow. And then the demand grows. And then next thing you know, you have a roaring corridor. The only other addition I would add is that the Jordanians throughout, for dating back to the 2000s, and a lot of the development in their Jordanian national rail plans have looked at Mafraq in northern Jordan as a key logistics hub, both for the Jordanian trucking industry, which is key for Iraq and Syria and Lebanon across the region for regional logistics, as well as for potential future railroad developments. So Mafraq and Jordan also is well poised to play a potential have a transformational role through IMEC. If you presume 20 to 30 years from now, you could envision a reality where through Aqaba Port, through Haifa Port, through broader regional integration, you could then see it going onto both a combination of trucks and rail that could then flow up into Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and completely rewrite the type of economic and the type of logistics and supply chains for the region. And so that's the other kind of, the Haifa to Jordan connection is really key for today, and thinking through how do you prove proof of concept. Jordan is also pivotal for the long-term future of integration in the region.
It's a great point, and fascinating to think about a corridor as ambitious as IMEC and breaking it down to a 12-kilometer gap. Dane, is there something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, so I think this is also an opportunity to be a little creative. With I know, for an example, there's the Jordan Gateway project, which has been around forever but hasn't actually come to fruition, and that also plugs in. It's the qualified industrial zone, which furthers on the special economic zones there. And it's also an important thing that I want to point out in regards to the U.S. side is, especially in Jordan and some of the other places along IMEC, is the idea of the financing. I know that's a very big thing, and as the U.S., we're all about burden sharing. We're not looking to provide a bunch of concessional capital. And however, we do have entities like DFC, where can come in and help provide some type of political risk mitigation in tools like that. But I just want to echo that, yeah, the Jordan-Israel connection is the biggest need as of now.
That's great. And to build on your point on financing, we have a question here from Steve about the role of multilateral institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and AIIB in filling some of the de-risking investments along the corridor. Is that something anyone here is interested in speaking to?
I feel like I've been talking a lot, so I welcome some other questions too. But I mean, it's a whole of stakeholder approach, I think, to IMEC. That one of the things, again, is that it's really, as a flat initiative that's stakeholder driven, is currently kind of, it's individually financed by governments that are partners to stakeholders in IMEC, or also companies like Aqua that are already making substantial and amazing investments within the GCN. It's about riding the wave and linking the wave to be able to be more than the sum of its parts. And so there's a role for multilateral development banks, there's a role for the World Bank, there's a role for EU, for Global Gateway in the EU, there's a role for US concessional finance potentially, and through DFC. It's a whole of partner approach, which I think that's really, as the coordinating body gets launched, as the ministerial gets launched, those details will be ironed out. And again, with G20, the US chairing G20 past December 1st, with the French chairing G7 this next year, there's also ample opportunities within multilateral bodies to be able to advance either IMEC as part of those initiatives as a key deliverable, or as with adjacent deliverables included in those processes.
If I can add to that,
please.
We have started to interact with all the major DFIs and commercial banks because financing will be, of course, one of the key enablers, and not so much for the availability of capital, but for the cost and the ability to offer low rates. So what I see is that we need to look at some new tools and governance, because these DFIs are not allowed today to invest in most of the countries around the corridor. So the portion of the infrastructure that they will be able to finance is very limited. What we see is, however, a great interest in connectivity, particularly on energy transmission. Today, they would be extremely interested in kind of financing the spin-offs, kind of to Jordan, Syria, to Iraq, and so on. But I think that we need to find together tools to enable them to also finance this type of infrastructure that provide a link across region. The other area that we are exploring is blended financing or concessional financing. That will have the biggest impact on making this project a reality. And there's 2 trillion of philanthropy every year. So our view, like we're doing in Africa and elsewhere, is to try to channel these philanthropy money into infrastructure projects. For instance, we have just signed the agreement for a desalination plant in Senegal, which is outside, of course, of this, but I can make the case for the IMEC corridor, where the blended financing can help reduce the cost of power, the cost of water desalination by almost 40%. So if we can find a way together with the public sector to make this work, it will accelerate the projects phenomenally.
It's some great examples, and I think pulling all of those pieces together is also very consistent, Dane, with the emphasis on burden sharing that you noted. I want to turn next to an interesting question from Graham. He points to past initiatives like the 3 Cs initiative to show how hard it is to sustain momentum in cross-regional infrastructure projects. What do we see as different about IMEC that gives it a better chance of success?
I mean, listen, because it's hard, we shouldn't do it. I think it is hard. It requires a lot of coordination. There will be a lot of risk associated with it. We still have to do it because, like I said, we are pivoting to order building, not really nation building as the United States. Therefore, we need to think creatively about how to build an order. We have done this in the Indo-Pacific. We build a lot of frameworks from Quad to Squad to AUKUS, because we are trying to figure out what's the right way to cohere a map into a system. And this is what we're trying to do between South Asia, the traditional Middle East, and the Mediterranean Sea. And yes, there is a lot of risk. There could be some moments where we don't really have the momentum. Clearly right now, there is a momentum despite all what we're seeing from a political risk, geopolitical risk. And I would say also on top of that, the numbers are staggering, right? The 3 Cs are, I would say it's a pioneer initiative in the way we're thinking about geography. But when it comes to India, Middle East, Europe corridor, We have the capital, we have the flow of trade, we have the coordination mechanism between governments. So we're not really starting from scratch. The numbers of bilateral trade between India, UAE, Saudi, Greece, Germany, France, those are really, really massive when it comes to trade volume within the G20 framework. So I would say, of course, you're going to find a lot of risk. Of course, nothing is guaranteed, but so far we have very positive signs when it comes to IMEC.
It's a great point, and I think this general principle of IMEC not building from scratch, that it's building on very real market and political realities that are playing out across the region.
Yeah, I know I've spoken with, in my efforts to engage the private sector, I mean, I've spoken with several different trucking companies that are already basically doing the IMEC route. And they've went in and they've analyzed, okay, yeah, this is why it's more efficient. However, there's certain roadblocks of the customs standards, bill of ladings, all of that stuff, which is where when IMEC comes in, the foundation's already laid, as you said. The foundation's laid on the government side. That's where we see ourselves engaging, help, harmonization of those standards, really building out the ability to unlock the potential, which the potential is very clear, as you guys have highlighted in the report. So I think that's one of the things that also gives us a better chance of success, that the private sectors are already identified the ways that can work.
Yeah, and if you have that political buy-in, bringing in the technical components and that dialogue with the private sector, then that's, again, the recipes for success. We have a somewhat similar, but I think differently intentioned question here from Alex about how IMEC differs from other connectivity issues like China's Belt and Road Initiative, and what makes it uniquely viable.
I would take that. I would say when you're thinking about the Belt and Road Initiative, it's a very Chinese way of doing a statecraft, trying to change everything within a Chinese way of thinking about trade, geopolitics, geoeconomics, and relationship with those sort of countries. So the intention behind Belt and Road Initiative is very clear. We can, of course, debate and argue about how successful this is materially when it comes to the actual infrastructure that you would say it's associated 100% with the Belt and Road Initiative. But this is the thinking coming out of Beijing. IMEC is more of, it's a stakeholder-driven initiative. I don't think the countries or the MOU signatories are thinking about it as one way or another of asserting dominance. There's, of course, a mutual respect that there are going to be some red lines that some of those countries may have. We're going to work around those. We're also coming with the understanding that this is not really a corridor against another corridor, right? When you talk to stakeholders in Saudi Arabia or UAE, they would say we do not, and India, we don't really perceive this as a way to say we are against an X corridor or an Y framework when it comes to trade. This is more of we have a major flow of capital and trade. We need to add a layer on top of that, and we think we like to work with each other. Here it is. And I think those are two completely different models. And more importantly is the question of finance. How are you financing this major infrastructure buildup from digital to actual physical infrastructure to trade? So you see the way that China has been financing its own infrastructure buildup is completely different. It's very much state-driven. It's what I call like China Inc. Ecosystem. You get Chinese financing, you get Chinese companies, you get Chinese engineers doing the work, and that's it. And you're, at the end of the day, you have to pay the pill. This is not really so far what we're seeing with IMEC, at least within the framework that was announced.
Really great points. And I'd like to hear Rajan or Afaq, since you're both sitting in India and the intersection between Asia and the Middle East, if you have your own perspectives on how IMEC differs from the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, may I, Rajan, go first, or?
Please.
If that's okay. Yeah, so see, one thing that I always say that let's not put IMEC versus BRI narrative. I think that's one thing we should avoid. I mean, China-driven BRI is completely, it's a different objective, it's a different narrative that they're bringing in. And one very important differentiator, as Mohammed just mentioned, is the finance. the financing for BRI, which comes from China state, is the differentiator there, and that makes it very, very. That gives them that opportunity to dominate. In IMEC, we are not dominating. There's not one country which is dominating on another country, and I think the another differentiator that could be possibly when the corridor is ready is how we are able to take countries like Jordan, countries and along the corridor, other countries within the corridor. When the corridor gets more and more countries, how we'll take all of them together, how it will be working towards the economic development of countries like Jordan and other countries which will come part of it. I think that's going to be the differentiator here. The dominant factor will not be there in the Europe, which are part of BRI. And they're going to be part of IMEC as well. So I think that differentiation will come into play in terms of the mutual economic interdependence within the countries. Yes, BRI is a 10-year-old initiative. It has already got 1 trillion of development of infrastructure. The trade is moving. As I always say this, there is something to learn also from BRI. I mean, we may also take some best practices also from BRI in terms of efficiency, in terms of speed, in terms of connectivity being developed within the countries. I think that's also something we may learn from BRI. We may not be competing with them.
Alison, can I just add one additional point, or Rajan?
Rajan, let's go to you first and then to Nick.
May I?
Please.
Sure. So I think just to add, firstly, I think there is both the history of centuries that has a lot of commonality between what we are trying to build now, what was existing in a lot of centuries back as well. So I think there is a lot of stronger people-to-people ties, a lot of softer issues that differentiate and that are symbiotic in nature about these things. But I think looking ahead, in my view, the future of IMEC will make a lot of difference, not just to the countries that are involved within the corridors, but I think even at a more macro level, it'll actually percolate down to the African continent as well. That's my personal view. And I think it's more of the benefit that will get derived in once this corridor comes into play in bits and pieces, and as it starts to take a much clearer shape. I think the benefits will be self-evident rather than being driven by any one entity, as has already been mentioned. And I think more around digital enablement, a whole lot of digital infrastructure and innovation is happening in all these domains. And I think that facilitation of that digital services and digital traffic going through is another key differentiator here.
Thanks so much, Rajan.
Yeah, I was going to add on and say that, so Mohammed said earlier, when you mentioned earlier about kind of the ports of geography, the engine that's driving IMEC economically is India and the Gulf. And it's Europe's relationship with India and the Gulf, as well as broader kind of new Eurasian integration dynamics, Syria, Iraq, et cetera. And so if you understand that that's the driver, whereas the BRI, the driver is access to strategic choke points. It's CPEC, it's in Pakistan. It's understanding how do you dodge the Straits of Malacca, how do you look at kind of strategic investments in ports and infrastructure around the world to kind of build and as part of geoeconomic statecraft from a very Chinese style and mode. And so when you understand the driver of IMEC as this very indigenous local opportunity that's being driven by that from the Gulf India engine that then is connecting into the broader region and integrating with new dynamics, then of course it just is a different initiative. And that's partly why the decentralized nature of IMEC, the stakeholder-driven financing, that's really important because it keeps that decentralized nature, which ultimately mean that it's a far more enduring contribution to the landscape of the region.
I think those are all really great points. And again, remembering, especially Dane, as you engage on this coordination process, that while that decentralized nature does create challenges, just as you're thinking about a coordinating body, it's also one of the great strengths of the corridor and what will make it truly resilient and better suited for the adaptability needed for an economy of the future. I very much appreciate all of the audience questions. We are running out of time, so I do just want to give an opportunity for all of our panelists to make any final closing remarks before we finish. Dane, turning first to you.
Yeah. So thanks for hosting this, and thanks to all the panel members. It's been a great discussion. I guess the last couple points I want to make are one, going back to something we've talked about a lot, is the private sector engagement. You've brought that up several times. So all of our private sector folks here in the U.S. government, we are here and happy to talk, so please reach out. We're all about engaging. And then also, and this kind of goes back to the last question about what truly makes IMEC unique. And we've talked a lot about the economic benefits, but I think it's also important to kind of realize what are some of the more on the geopolitical side. And I think a lot of that has to do, and this differentiates with BRI, is this is truly a multilateral engagement process. We see this as a way to really drive in peace with the region, advance initiatives like the Abraham Accords, for example. And there's a lot that can happen with IMEC. And for regards to the coordinating body, we're working on that. We appreciate opportunities like this to come out here and talk about this, really kind of amplify the IMEC message, kind of socialize what's going on and how we can really turn it into a reality. And part of that takes dialogues like this provided by Atlantic Council and such. So thank you.
Thanks, Dane. Margot, next to you. Any closing remarks?
Well, yes, I think I would like to reiterate the importance of speed, because the fastest dialogue and the decisions, and then the fastest, the lowest, the development cost, the lowest, the cost of capital, because the risk is lower, lowest the financing cost, and then we can make all these much more feasible in the short term. And I look forward really for appointment of people by the various governments. I've seen that some very high caliber personalities have been appointed. I really count on them to be able to push each government to support the private sector to make this reality.
Wonderful. Rajan, turning to you.
I think just emphasizing 2 points. Firstly, the focus once again on resilience at the time of the planning and development stage itself is going to be very important, given the challenges that we can anticipate currently and in the future. And I think more importantly, the report has been really a wonderful initiative to really stitch together some of these thoughts and bring more of commonality to the approaches that we need to focus on. So good luck with the report, and hopefully we should be able to engage more on that.
Thank you so much. Udi, anything you can add for closing remarks?
Yeah, first of all, a very, very interesting panel, and I personally enjoyed it, and it's a super exciting project. I would add one thing in terms of, we talked about resilience and the relationship between the countries involved. I think what's very, very important in order to make it successful is a cross-border regulation alignment. Think about data privacy, think about the usage of cloud infrastructure, for all the infrastructure that needs to run there, and share of information between the different governments involved. This is key to the success of this project. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Mohammed, anything from your end?
Thank you for moderating this. Thank you, Nick and Afaq, for the report. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for having me here. That was a wonderful discussion. A few things for my closing remarks. One, do not think about geography as a siloed way or traditional way. Geographies are changing in the way we're thinking about it when it comes to trade capital, and you're seeing this with the India-Middle East-Europe corridor. Your own traditional way of thinking about a Middle East where Iran is the border, this is the end of it, and it ends with Syria, is no longer the reality. The reality is India is part of the Middle East. It's not really the Middle East, it's West Asia. This is how I call this system. The second thing, it is compute, capital, and connectivity are going to be the three themes for this sort of interdependence and growing bilateral relationship and multilateral relationship across that system. And those are going to be big themes for the United States to engage with those countries. It's no longer about energy with the Gulf. It's more about AI. It's about data infrastructure. It's about capital growth. It's about how we see us as the United States working with the Gulf on next generation transformation for this region.
Thanks so much, Mohammed. And thank you again to Nick and Afaq for the report and all your research. I've heard a lot today, but even just in these closing remarks, the importance of dialogue, the importance of speed, resilience, cross-border alignment, and breaking down our old assumptions about how things worked, I think all really compelling takeaways. And I can say on behalf of the N7 initiative, we are very committed to continuing to support this exciting initiative. The real work is going to be done by the governments and the private sector, but anything that we can continue to do to help support the emerging coordination process, to continue to fill some of these information gaps and to facilitate dialogue, we're committed to partnering with everyone here today. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists and invite those to join us across the hall for a reception. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.